which is a presentation from Sustainable Solutions Group, SSG. I'd like to introduce Yul and Ralph from SSG. Thank you so much, you guys, for joining us today to present the summary of the report, the results of the report, and top recommendations from the report. And really kind of helping to explain it. It's such a complicated topic, really wanting to empower and enable municipalities to engage in this conversation with the province, because there's some real values and valuable input municipalities can bring to this conversation that is so important for us to all collectively understand. Because if we don't, we miss out on a huge opportunities associated with the energy efficiency opportunities, the job creation opportunities that come from advancing those energy efficiency opportunities, the local economic development opportunities that would benefit all of our communities if we truly advance the energy efficiency opportunity in Ontario. And ultimately, it can help decarbonize our electricity system, and it can make our electricity system more cost effective. So it's a good story, but we've got some serious challenges ahead of us in engaging all of the players we need in this energy transition, because there is a strong tendency to do the same old, and that is a lost opportunity for Ontario. And I'm going to leave it to Yul and to Ralph to tell the story of the opportunity available to Ontario should we decide to take on this challenge. So thank you, Yul, and Ralph, take it away.
Thank you, Gabby. I'm very pleased to be here. We are going to share some observations on the IESO's Pathway to Decarbonization study in the context of municipal climate action plans. And we've titled the presentation "An Irresistible Force Meets an Immovable Object," and we'll leave it up to you to conclude what that refers to. So just to give you a bit of background, SSG has been working on climate action plans across Canada and the US, and also in Latin America in Canada in particular, for 20 years. It's our passion, and our primary focus is developing climate action plans. And we have with us also Ralph here, who has even a longer trajectory in this space. We've worked with most of the large municipalities in Ontario and many smaller ones. And increasingly, we're also working with utility regulators on exactly the type of questions that IESO is considering. So I'm going to pass it over to Ralph to talk a little bit about the Pathway to Decarbonization study.
Thank you, Yul, and thank you everyone for coming to this conversation this afternoon on this such an important topic, in my view anyway. Excuse me. I'm just getting over all the wildfire smoke that came through my town over the last week, and my voice hasn't totally recovered. We had it pretty bad here on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. This slide basically gives a very brief summary of the IESO's decarbonization pathway study. It's quite a fascinating document in many ways. The IESO, as I think you all know, is the agency that's basically now responsible for thinking about our electricity future. It used to be the Ontario Power Authority which has been sort of rolled into the IESO, which previously really only had the job of operating the system, hence the name System Operator. Before the Ontario Power Authority, for 10 years, there was no long-range planning of electricity, more like 15 years, from the demise of the demand supply plan and the environmental assessment in 1991, when it was canceled, until the Power Authority was established in 2004, I think it was. There was really nobody doing any long-range capital planning because we had such a surplus from the bad decisions we had made earlier and the overbuilding that we had done. There really wasn't any need to be thinking about new build. Prior to that, Ontario Hydro itself really took on the job of long-range electricity planning. And what we have now with the IESO decarbonization strategy is a pathway that has been built on top of their annual outlook for the Ontario electricity system, which came out in December. And the government then said, well, we'd like you to look at two possibilities. What would it look like if we put a moratorium on additional natural gas generation? And what would it look like what would our electricity future look like in a decarbonized Ontario by the year 2050? And it's that second one which has really been the focus of our review and will be the focus of our comments here this afternoon. So they took their outlook and basically concluded that consumption of electricity would double from its current level of a little under 150 terawatt hours to about 300 terawatt hours by 2050. This is from the electric cars and the heat pumps and all the other electrification, which everybody agrees will be part of a low carbon future. The capacity in the pathway they came up with also more than doubles from 42 gigawatts to 88 gigawatts. And when you add in retirements, it's a massive amount of electricity capacity building, more than we've built, in all of history by quite a margin. So you've got new nuclear, new hydro and upgraded hydro, massive expansion of the transmission system. And the total investment of this pathway, somewhere in the range of $375 to $425 billion. And that was so reminiscent for me. I got started in this area in 1976. When Ontario Hydro, as I mentioned earlier, who at the time were responsible for long-range electricity planning in Ontario, came forward with a capital expansion plan. I'll have a slide about it in a minute, but it called for 24 nuclear power plants post-Darlington, 18 coal plants, all of which would be online by about 2005. Thanks, Yul. And the Conservative government of the day actually sort of freaked out. It was the capital requirements of the plan that really bothered Darcy McHugh, who was the treasurer at the time, and Bill Davis, who was the premier. So they called a halt to it. They appointed the Dean of Engineering of the University of Toronto to head a Royal Commission. Arthur Porter became the Porter Royal Commission to look into how electricity planning had got so far off the rails in Ontario that our utility, this great historic organization, this paragon of engineering and technocratic achievement, could put such an obviously impossible future on the table as a serious proposal. And none of the plants in that plan were ever built. The gap between the existing capacity at the time and what they said they needed to build never materialized. In fact, that gap to this day is bigger than the total demand of all the electricity in province in Ontario in 2023. They at the time, Hydro had said that demand would grow at 6%, maybe more per year, more or less indefinitely, and we would have to build like crazy to keep up with it, and that was basically the basis for the long-range plan. The demand slowed right down in the 1980s to about 2.5% per year. None of those plants were ever built. Then in 1989, Ontario Hydro came forward with another massive capital expansion plan. This time they said we were going to have a gap by 2005 of 9,700 megawatts, and it would grow to 21,000 megawatts by 2014. That it was extremely unlikely, less than a 10% probability that the demand could possibly end up being lower than the low end of that range. The plan was withdrawn 2 years later when Maurice Strong was brought in to head up Ontario Hydro. None of those plants were ever built. The gap never materialized. And throughout the 1990s, we saw the demand for electricity grow at barely 1% per year, even as the Ontario economy expanded, the population expanded, And even as all of Ontario Hydro's energy conservation and efficiency programs from the 1980s basically were discontinued. Then getting into the living memory of a larger number of you than myself, in 2004, 2005, people began to think that maybe we better start thinking about expanding our electricity system. Climate change was still not a big issue. It should have been, wasn't. Electrification was still not a big issue. The heat pump and the low-cost solar power and the electric car, which have made the electrification scenario a possibility, really were not serious options yet, not quite. And so again, however, a big gap was projected. Gas plants were, approval of those gas plants was expedited on the basis of that forecast. The gap never materialized. The gas plants, and it's kind of tragic considering all of the scandal and effort that's gone on around arguing and fighting over those plants, they never really were needed. And the demand today is about where it was at that time, 15 years later. In fact, it declined for most of the past 15 years and has only apparently in the last 2 or 3 years started to recover. So that's a bit of historical context. I figured I lived that story, so I might as well give you a bit of a picture of it, because now we're entering a situation where climate change is front and center. Everyone who looks at how we can possibly get ourselves out of the climate trap comes to different variations of the same conclusion. We need to move much more of our transportation energy use and much more of our heat energy use into electric applications. We've got the technology to do this now in extremely efficient ways that we did not have 10 or 15 years ago. And if we can decarbonize the electricity system while at the same time making that transition to electrified transport and electrified heat through heat pumps and EVs and so on, there is a path forward to a low carbon post-fossil fuel future. So hence the request from the government to IESO to take a look at what that might look at. When you look at their take on that, the thing that really strikes me is that when you compare it to all of the ground up, bottom up work that local governments have been doing in this province and around the world, trying to understand what a carbon-free post-fossil fuel community might look like in the case of their city or their community. So there's a lot of these studies, even in Ontario, much more effort has gone into that work than has gone into this IESO decarbonization study. And it gives a very different picture. And in trying to understand it, I think it's worth noting that, first of all, these local climate action plans start out with the objective of creating a fossil-free community, not a fossil-free electricity system, although that's part of the package that they end up recommending. But they look at the system from a much larger perspective and in the context of a climate emergency. Otherwise, who really cares how efficient the electricity system is? It's because of its potential to help us get out of the climate trap that it's playing such a central role in our policy conversation right now. Whereas when you look at the method used in the IESO study, it's more or less the same type of methodology that we've seen all those years, where the role of decarb, or the objective of getting carbon out of the electricity system, is slapped on the traditional planning method as a constraint on the way on the number of, as a constraint on the system that would be possible. So the municipal action plans have a more comprehensive view of the system than the IESO, which is much narrower. As the next slide indicates, they also take an integrated approach that brings in even things like energy efficiency and land use and mobility systems, all of which can affect the demand for energy services, which in turn affects the demand for fuel and electricity. Whereas when you look at the IESO approach, it's much more narrowly focused on what are the existing electricity using technologies that can be, and producing technologies that can be brought to bear on a underlying growth in electricity demand, or energy demand, which is basically continuing to behave the way it has historically. So I find, before I just turn this back over to you, I find myself in the odd position where, well, first of all, this final slide I wanted to touch on is that when you look at these municipal climate action plans, they do conclude that the electricity system has to grow, but at about 1% per year, whereas the pathway in the IESO report is 2 to 3% per year. This is an enormous difference when you spread it out over 30 years. It's the difference between a 300 terawatt hour system and something under 200 terawatt hours, which is all the difference in the world, actually. And the one message I really wanted to leave with you, or the one thought I wanted to leave with you this afternoon, is that it's very tempting right now, given the very strong consensus that, of course, we have to have electric vehicles, and of course, we have to have heat pumps in our buildings to provide heat. So, of course, the electricity grid has to double or triple in size. I would just like to suggest that it may not necessarily be the case that it needs to grow that much. There's a lot of evidence in these bottom-up studies that the growth of electricity, when it's taking place in the context of a system in which energy services are being provided more efficiently, in which mobility is being, the demand for mobility itself is being moderated by cities that are designed and operated in a more mobility efficient way, in a future in which buildings themselves are more energy efficient and therefore requiring less thermal energy. When you add all of this up, not to mention the 3 to 5-fold increase in efficiency that comes with heat pumps and electric vehicles over their fossil fuel counterparts, the overall growth rate in the demand for electricity may be much smaller than what the IESO is telling us it looks like to them in a decarbonized future. And if I hadn't been through this in 1976 and in 1989 and 2004, where they, in all three of those cases, said there's very, very little chance that the demand would be lower than what our lowest bound is in our future, I might be more tempted to go along with their conclusion. But my plea would be that this is a time when we really need, and the municipalities, I think, in this province, was where this all started, by the way. If you look at the history of electric power in this province, this is an historical moment where the municipalities need to step up with their understanding of their communities, with their local climate action plans, which have a lot of detail in them about how we can move forward without necessarily trying to build the impossible future, which is laid out in the IESO strategy. So I'm sorry I've skipped around, Yul, and covered some of the later slides. You don't have to come back to me now. I wanted to get my sermon off my chest right off the top, I guess. I'll turn it back to you to try and get us back on track.
Thanks, Ralph. I think the main story you've been telling is basically the climate, or the paradigm that municipalities have been working on under, is really a different paradigm than what IESO has been working under, for all of those reasons that you've articulated. And we see lots of evidence of that when we try and deconstruct the scenarios that they've developed. And I think the one last piece that I would highlight as a difference is the climate action plans, which municipalities have developed, which some might argue are unrealistic as well, or very ambitious, have a lot of community support and have gone through extensive community engagement processes and been passed by councils. Whereas the pathway to decarbonization study that IESO did have indeed engagement process, but it's a much more technical and narrow engagement process. So it doesn't, I don't think, have the same level of community oomph that the municipal climate action plans do. So you see this like really different set of paradigms that in one case, we're investing a ton of money in electricity generation. In the municipalities' climate action plans, we're investing a lot of money in energy conservation. And I think that's a different paradigm that the IESO really hasn't yet got its head around. And this is just to reemphasize Ralph's point. This is a selection of municipal climate action plans. Each of these projects typically has a budget of 100, 150, 200,000, 250,000 in some cases. So these are major investments by communities, multiple year analysis, very technical. So municipalities are investing a lot of time and money in figuring out their pathway to decarbonize. And this is just the planning piece. Then there's the whole implementation piece. And so this effort is not at all reflected in the IESO pathway decarbonization scenarios. And Ralph mentioned the rate of growth. So this is, we summed up a number of the climate action plans we worked on and to show the total growth in electricity from 2016 to 2050, and this is what you get. And this is really because we're evaluating all of those demand side measures. And in an electrified energy system, all of a sudden a trip that's walking rather than driving is actually a electricity conservation measure. So it's no longer about replacing light bulbs, it's about getting people out of cars. So that's like a fundamental shift in electricity planning in Ontario that really I don't think anyone has got their heads around. Like transportation demand management is now electricity conservation. It's a really interesting new paradigm. I'll skip over this one, which Ralph, you covered in good detail, which is really the growth sort of mentality that is prevalent not just in IESO, but in most electricity utility regulators globally. And this, I think, slide highlights, this is from Toronto's net zero strategy, net zero by 2040. And it really shows what happens in that scenario to electricity. You can see on the left-hand side in a business as planned scenario, that's grid electricity in the yellow bar there. A lot of natural gas in the system still. In the net zero strategy, the natural gas is phased out, as is gasoline, but you can see the electricity doesn't grow as much as you might anticipate. And there's also a bunch of behind the meter electricity, which reduces the burden on the provincial electricity system. So there are very clear pathways which don't significantly increase electricity consumption. Now, these pathways vary from municipality to municipality. Like Hamilton, for example, because of the electrification of the steel industry, does project a bigger increase in electricity consumption. But in aggregate, it's still not as significant. And a lot of that is because of building retrofits. Building retrofits are the magic that save that $300 billion investment that IESO is projecting. So you can either invest $300 billion in new electricity generation or something significantly less than $300 billion in building retrofits. And that's kind of a trade-off that's a really interesting piece to explore, which was not really evaluated. Another critique that we noted from the scenarios that IESO evaluated is there's some strange constraints in their scenario, one in particular on wind, and also not as much solar. And we looked at, for example, two other deep decarbonization electricity systems analysis, one from the UK Climate Change Committee and one from National Renewable Energy Laboratories in the US. This is the share of electricity, solar and wind generation in their electricity system by 2035. And you look at what IESO is projecting for solar and wind by 2050. And you can quickly see that for some reasons, which are not clear from the analysis, wind and solar are not deployed at the same levels that they are in other jurisdictions. And that wind and solar in the case of IESO is really a lot of that gap, if you call it a gap, is filled by expansion of nuclear. And then another critique we sort of argued from the IESO study is that they really just show the capital costs. They don't look at the system costs or the societal costs or benefits in this case. And this is a similar study that was completed by the NREL in the US, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and they show the social cost of carbon and the health benefits alongside the system costs. And you quickly see that those benefits significantly dwarf the system costs, but that perspective is not available in the IESO report. So based on those critiques, from the perspective of municipalities, we made a number of recommendations. The very first recommendation is basic planning, scenario planning. We need more scenarios. There's only one 2050 scenario. I think there's lots of questions about that particular scenario. There's other interesting scenarios that could be explored, including ones that align with the municipal climate action plans. Those are not evaluated. In particular, a scenario which achieves significant reductions of demand would be really interesting to explore, as well as some other scenarios around, say, 24-hour clean carbon-free energy, which is a trend that is growing for some municipalities. Most of the carbon-free or zero emissions electricity is based on an annual basis, but looking at a 24-hour carbon-free electricity would be a really interesting scenario. As Ralph mentioned, the IESO study was not an integrated systems analysis. So we really need to look at the whole system, not just the supply side. More fundamentally, it became clear, and it has been for a while, I think, that the IESO mandate is limiting. And the UK agency, similar to IESO, Ofgem, just the UK government just required a mandate for it to consider the net zero targets of the UK within its actual planning process. And IESO, like Ralph mentioned, really is slapping on the decarbonization approach rather than making that a core element of its analysis. We also wanted to understand the regional impacts of the decarbonization pathway from the municipality's perspective, and that has implications, for example, on job creation, on equity. So all of those variables were not considered as well in the pathway to decarbonization study. Another element we noted, which we'd recommend, is that climate change impacts be included in the scenarios, which they weren't, and that has a significant impact on heating demand and cooling demand. And then, of course, transparency. The modeling assumptions underlying the study are not clear, and Ralph made a valiant attempt to reconstruct the findings, but could not. And I think that really highlights the need to actually understand what the assumptions are, why, for example, some of the constraints which were applied on wind or solar were applied the way they were. So that information is not available. Another recommendation is a fuller sense of the economic costs and benefits, which was not available. And as a result, the headlines that were associated with the IESO study were really, this is going to be a massive cost, but there's no sense of whether there's a cost or benefit. So including a full set of the economic impacts is also critical. There is some consideration around the federal regulations on electricity system within the IESO report, but it doesn't look at the risk of stranded assets. And we think, for example, that if there is ongoing expansion of natural gas generation capacity in Ontario, that could create a significant financial burden, which not only has an opportunity cost, but also could be a stranded asset for the province in the context of increasing demand for response to climate emergency. So that kind of assessment, that lens wasn't applied in the study. We also had a recommendation around the accounting system. Municipalities are using a very specific accounting framework for emissions, and it would be good if the IESO aligned with that so municipalities could reflect those impacts within their own planning processes. And two more, the second to last recommendation was around distribution, because many municipalities still own LDCs, local distribution companies in Ontario, and understanding what the implications of the decarbonization scenario for those LDCs is a really important consideration, but also reflecting how the LDCs are responding to municipal climate action plans within the IESO's planning regime. So a two-way street. And then the last piece is syncing up local energy planning between IESO's regional planning processes and municipal climate action planning, which is beginning to happen. And I think that's sort of in its nascent steps. So that could be an important development going forward. So I guess we gave sort of a summary of the critique of the IESO report with the sort of historical context, and then a set of 11 recommendations as to how IESO and more broadly the government can move forward to actually implement a pathway that really supports where municipalities are coming at from their climate action plans. That's it.
Thanks so much, Yul. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Ralph, for the presentation. I think one of the things that I just wanted to kind of highlight before we open it up to questions, one of the things I really highlighted when I kind of read the report back from SSG, my first thought was, oh, well, that explains a lot of the mismatch between the IESO provincial planning framework, the way they advance it, and the municipal energy plans. What I thought was particularly interesting about this is that one of the things that if you with a focus on supply and increasing supply, there is going to be, construction jobs, the economic development, but it's going to be so localized to the construction time period, and it's only going to be localized to specific communities. So if you wanted to kind of say, well, we need to produce more electricity, and this could be an economic development opportunity, that economic development opportunity associated with increasing supply is minuscule in comparison to the economic development opportunity and the job creation opportunity that could be available to all Ontario communities if we change the focus from just only focusing in on supply and actually worked on developing customer-oriented programs that helped reduce the demand for energy in the first place, which would be resolved by local economic development in the sense of, purchasing local maybe not some local products, but certainly purchasing products locally, and the job creation opportunity, because a lot of these energy efficiency measures are all very labor intensive, and there's huge job creation opportunities associated with it that all Ontario communities could benefit from if we plan this right. We risk missing this opportunity that I think is something that's really important. So I'm going to